there are people out there who are doing it, because basically, if we try and, for many people, when I try and introduce them to a topic, if I bring up a 15th century alchemical text, they roll their eyes and they immediately turn off. And yet if I say, hey, did you see this movie, they can relate to it, and you progress the conversation a lot faster. So
very wise, sir. Yeah. Very wise.
Yeah, I think very often there is like I said, it's a smart move to bring it into that sense. But in this case, I just happened to be talking to somebody recently about where they think there's a very strong correlation between Stanley Kubrick's movie 2001 and Stanley Kubrick's movie The Shining. He feels they were made as parallel movies. And so he has set up an arrangement to watch them side by side. And when I watched this, what I realized, now he didn't get out of it I didn't get out of it what he thought I was going to. We got two different things out of it. But what I got out of it was that The Shining, as dark as it is a very, I think we lost Neil.
No, I'm still here.
Oh, okay. The Shining is a very almost uplifting story. It is the dark unveiling. They go through hell, but then come out the other side. And I thought of the father, what's his name, Jack Nicholson character, as basically that old law, that demiurge sort of father that need to be swayed, and that he was essentially this ego figure. And of course, you just mentioned the ego should be the caretaker. And what does he learn at the end of the movie but that he's always been the caretaker? It's like saying, remember your role.
In the photograph, etc.
Yeah, remember your role. You're the caretaker.
Well, let me just stop you there for a moment. Let me just stop you there for a moment.
Duty to consensus reality.
I've just got to tell you this before we go any further.
Yeah.
Last month, I went to the Timberline Lodge where the external shots for The Shining were shot.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yes, which is not hugely surprising, living where I do, near Hood River in Oregon, but that lodge has always been very, very special image to me. And one of the things that I've had on my list for a long time is to go and visit the hotel where that was shot, the external shots at least, and some of the entrance shots. And it's virtually the same today. It's very old, it's very eerie, it's very, very isolated. And just flying back from New York a couple of days ago, we flew over Mount Hood, which is where it's on the slopes of, just in the evening, and I saw the lodge lit up. And it is a very unusual place. And yeah, just as you bring that up, I just have to throw that in.
Doug, you were trying to say?
Oh, I was trying to say that Jack is torn between, his duty to his family and his duty to consensus reality as the caretaker of, the world as it is, the dog-eat-dog world, where he's running the hotel in the absence of, as the caretaker, he's got to make sure the furnace keeps working and that reality functions as the Empire would have it function, but that conflicts with his role as father and husband.
Yeah, it does, and it starts to kind of like show other aspects with Danny, who, is operating in fourth density consciousness, basically, along with the black guy, I forget his name, Hong Kong Phooey man. Yeah, it's really interesting. So that particular thing for me balances out with the Shelley Duvall character, who represents normality, a good human being, basically. So you've got this little trinity in the family that represents, the existing, the old, the new, the classical, the archetypal, and it is interesting. It's a phenomenal movie as well, by the way.
Yeah, indeed.
And the book is actually pretty good too. And so you were talking about alchemical texts and people rolling their eyes. I really think Stephen King is doing a great service where he's able to bring all this really deep psychological transformation to, I don't want to say it, he puts it in the language of the everyday people where it's interesting to read, and they might not get that the first time they read it. I know I did. I read Stephen King in high school, but then later you see how much is really there.
Neil, in your ARC conference talk, I saw that on YouTube. Um, you bring up at the beginning William S. Burroughs and the idea that he was able to, as a fiction writer, he was able to inject so much more that, you know, basically get away with saying things or introducing topics that you wouldn't be able to get away with as an academic. Um, I wonder why it is that, you know, people are reluctant to hear some of these ideas. Even, you know, nowadays, you have this very big science fiction fandom. You know, these people who have comic conventions and all these things. And
We'll
yet,
talk about Philip K. Dick, Alan. You know, where, you know, basically his science fiction is really well received, but then his exegesis, where it seems like he's taking on a Gnostic mythology, people start wondering if he isn't a nutter.
yeah,
you know?
I've seen a recording of a talk where he gave, where he's saying, these are the experiences I had, and everyone's looking at each other in the room like, what is this guy talking about? So why
But
is
you
it that...
put it into fiction and they just eat it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's the old idea of cognitive dissonance, where if you presented with something like you know, Brazil or Blade Runner or The Shining or whatever, Star Wars, Dawn of the Dead, anything like that, you can explore these different scenarios of how people's lives can radically shift and transform, and how societies can change, you know, in such unbelievable ways. But to actually start to imagine that's happening down the street, or it's happening in Queens in New York, or it's happening in Portland in Oregon, people feel funny about that because they're not really in a psychological place to deal with it. So I think the interesting thing that's happening now is that as we move into the, you know, the beginning of the 21st century, people are more ready for that. I think even from, you know, the 1970s and the 1980s, there's been a huge shift, and I think people are kind of, to put it bluntly, they're kind of like, well, there's not much to lose really. Let's give something else a go because this sucks. So let's try something different. And there's a lot of collapses and a lot of meltdowns in people's personal lives as well. I've seen and noticed, and people have volunteered that information to me about their own lives, and you know, the crisis that you know, that brings to the life is often just kind of like gift wrapping of something pretty precious, really. And that's again the silver lining to the cloud, in that the same people will come back and say, remember that awful thing that I was telling you about? Well, because of that, something marvelous happened, something amazing happened. So, you know, they got divorced, or they lost a job, or they went bankrupt, or something, you know, pretty shocking that would knock anybody. But that crisis was a fundamental realization, and the universe seems to do that on a pretty regular basis, in that it throws these little traumas and these little weird, you know, nuggets into our life. And if you can just have, again, the perspective to stand aside from yourself, if not above yourself, at least just see it from a sort of third-person perspective, you realize that there's something in there. And I have this kind of idea that the worse the crisis is, the more you've been ignoring that voice for a long time. So if you knew that you hated being an accountant, say, and still you stuck at it for 30 years, the crisis that finally knocks you onto a path of self-realization will be all the more dramatic and, you know, difficult to ignore. Whereas if you listen to that voice early on, you can make adjustments, you can make the necessary arrangements to kind of shift more harmoniously with that, and watch the patterns and listen to the, you know, the clues that lie in your environment. And I've certainly found that, and I've done both. I've had things that have kind of knocked me on my ass, you know, big style, and then I've seen, as I've wised up from that, I've seen the little clues out there and thought, oh, hang on a second, yeah, this situation that I could ignore, which would make things immediately a little bit easier for me, I'm actually not going to, because I see the sort of meta narrative now. I understand, so I plunge myself into it, and I'll go in right into the middle of it as an experiment, even though it might be unpleasant, and just kind of stand there, you know, with a little bit of defiance, but not egotistical, more sort of like a warrior. They'll just think, right, well, come on then, bring it on. Let's see what you've got. And if you can just remain centered in that, you can usually, deflect whatever difficulties come, but absorb the teaching behind it. So I see that more and more and more happening with people, not just sort of conscious students of spirituality or whatever, but also just regular people who seem to volunteer this. Just sat on the plane the other day with this lady, total stranger next to me, and she tells me a story, and it's the same pattern. I just hear it over and over.
So what do you make of that? So, like, in the second part of your piece, you talk about telepathy and how you connect to that field and then take in, the idea of something that is temporally coming in the future. Do you intuit the future a little bit, or do you read this darkness that you're seeing around you as a larger coming darkness, or is that even relevant to you?
I'm not sure I know what you mean, but I think that kind of connection to the field, the fourth density field of, this informational layer that is atemporal, so you can see backwards, forwards, left and right, whatever. That happens all the time, I think. Like, not just like, oh, we're all a bit psychic, we all know that, but I think it happens at a profound level all the time, but we filter it out. We actually block it out. So the trick with this kind of field connection, this field uplink or whatever, is creating stillness, is kind of getting the static out of the way. So it's just like a radio station where the signal is very weak from the fourth density, because it's a very subtle thing when you're a dense meat sack like we are. So you have to kind of shift out of that, and the way to do it is to create this extraordinary stillness, and we all know there's different ways of achieving that. And when you do that, just like with the radio, you can then turn up the volume on that week, but you can't do that when there's a lot of static, because obviously it would just melt you. But once you isolate the signal and create stillness and silence around it, you can then amplify it. And those are the moments where you can look around the corner and you can peep around the next series of events, and it's kind of like deja vu, but instead of you riding it as it just spontaneously happens, you actually push it out, you actually instigate it and push it out, your field of vision, instead of being, your immediate environment and your immediate few seconds, pushes out a little bit further. And the more stillness you create, the more silence you create, the bigger that field becomes. So your sphere of influence, your circle of knowing, as I call it in the book, extends out. And that requires a certain amount of power, a certain amount of personal sort of psychic accrual. And if you're really busy and you're doing loads of things and you're juggling 2 jobs and you've got some kids and there's a lot going on, you're not really going to have the bandwidth for that. So you have to create circumstances for yourself where that's possible. So that energy is energy. You're using energy, drinking a glass of milk, just like you're using energy when you're dreaming. It's all the same thing, but you have to choose what to do with it. It's like in the Castaneda books, semi-fictional perhaps, but whatever. The character of Don Juan talks about the sorcerers of antiquity, and he says they were like extremely aggressive and protective about how they would protect their energy source. So they would like wear certain colours and only eat certain foods and only go out on certain days and stuff. Also, they could store up this energy charge so they could make these non-ordinary conscious maneuvers. And it's a little bit like that, but I mean, I kind of love the world too much to go to those lengths right now, and I think my path is one of engagement rather than hermitage, but
and so does that mean that, I know you speak at length about shamanism, but part of that is to achieve the non-ordinary states of consciousness, they take some sort of psychedelic substance oftentimes.
Yeah.
And where that's something that we've talked about a lot as this show has progressed. The benefits of that, and then the potential harms of that. How do you feel about it?